The keys felt heavier than they should have when the lawyer handed them to me across his mahogany desk. Two brass keys on a simple ring, worn smooth by decades of use. "Your uncle's estate is straightforward, Mr. Reed," he'd said, sliding a manila folder toward me. "The lake house, its contents, and a small sum to cover property taxes for the year. He was very specific that you should have it." I drove north from Minneapolis on a Thursday in late September, watching the city give way to suburbs, then farmland, then endless stretches of pine forest. The further I drove, the more the radio stations faded to static until I was left with only the hum of my tires on asphalt and my own thoughts. I needed this. The cramped studio apartment, the rejection letters from galleries, the suffocating pressure of trying to make it as an artist in a city that didn't care. It had all become too much. A secluded lake house in northern Minnesota sounded like exactly the kind of escape I needed to reset, to find my creative center again. Uncle Daniel had always been the family eccentric. My mother's older brother, he'd left Minneapolis 40 years ago and never really came back, except for the occasional holiday visit where he'd sit quietly in the corner, seeming uncomfortable in his own skin around people. I remembered him as kind but distant, a man who preferred solitude to conversation. When my mother told me he'd died, a heart attack, they said, found in his home 3 days later, I'd felt a pang of guilt that I hadn't known him better. The GPS lost signal about 20 miles from the property, but the lawyer had provided detailed directions. "Turn off Highway 71 onto County Road 33. Follow it for 12 miles until you see the wooden sign for Whispering Pines Road. Take that for another 3 miles until the road turns to gravel, then dirt. The house will be at the end overlooking Lake Miriam." I found it just as the sun began its descent toward the tree line. The house was larger than I'd expected, a 2-story structure with weathered cedar siding that had grayed with age, a wraparound porch and a steep roof that suggested a significant attic space. It sat in a clearing surrounded by dense pine forest, with the lake stretching out behind it like a sheet of darkening glass. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the orange and pink sky with an almost unnatural clarity. The porch steps creaked under my weight as I approached the front door. The second key, smaller than the first, unlocked it easily and the door swung inward with a low groan. The interior smelled of wood smoke, old books, and something else I couldn't quite place. Something organic and slightly sweet, like dried flowers or herbs. The main floor was exactly what you'd expect from a lake house occupied by a solitary man for 4 decades. A living room with a stone fireplace, worn leather furniture, and bookshelves crammed with volumes on local history, nature, and what appeared to be folklore. A small kitchen with ancient appliances but meticulously clean counters. A study off to the side, its desk covered in papers and more books. Everything was neat, organized, as if my uncle had simply stepped out and would return at any moment. I set my bags down and began exploring, opening windows to air out the space. Upstairs I found 2 bedrooms and a bathroom with vintage fixtures. One bedroom was clearly my uncle's, a simple bed, a dresser, a nightstand with a reading lamp. The other appeared to be a guest room that had likely never hosted guests, its bed made with military precision, its surfaces dust-free. Between the 2 bedrooms, I noticed a door I'd almost missed, painted the same color as the walls, with no handle, only a keyhole. The attic access, I assumed. I tried the doors, but it was locked and neither of my keys fit. When I returned downstairs, I noticed the notebook on the kitchen counter. It was impossible to miss, really. A leather-bound journal sitting in the exact center of the worn Formica surface, a folded piece of paper tucked into its cover. My name was written on the paper in my uncle's shaky handwriting. "Evan, read this first." I unfolded the note. The message was brief, written in the same unsteady hand. Evan, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I'm sorry to leave you with this burden, but you're the only family I trust. This house has been in our family for 3 generations, and with it comes a responsibility. I know you'll think I'm crazy. Your mother certainly did. But everything I'm about to tell you is true. Read these rules. They will keep you safe. Do not dismiss them. Do not ignore them. Your life depends on following them exactly. I learned them the hard way. Don't make my mistakes. Uncle Daniel. I opened the journal. The first page contained a list written in firm block letters, as if my uncle had wanted to ensure perfect legibility. The rules of the lake house. Rule 1. Never leave the house at night, especially after the fog rolls in. Rule 2. Do not open the attic door. Rule 3. If the lake seems still and the water goes black, stay inside. Rule 4. If you hear your name being called in the woods, do not answer. Rule 5. Lock all windows at sunset and never, under any circumstances, leave one open. I stood there in the dimming light of the kitchen, reading and rereading the list. Then I did what anyone would do. I laughed. It was absurd. My uncle, isolated out here for decades, had clearly developed some paranoid delusions. The rules read like something from a creepypasta forum, the kind of thing teenagers share to scare each other at sleepovers. Never leave the house at night. It was the country. Dark, sure, but hardly dangerous. Don't open the attic door. Probably full of junk or had structural issues. The lake turning black. Algae blooms were common in Minnesota lakes. Hearing your name in the woods. Auditory pareidolia, the brain's tendency to find patterns in random noise. Lock the windows? Basic security, but hardly mystical. I flipped through the rest of the journal. Page after page of my uncle's writing, growing increasingly erratic as the entries progressed. References to the fog, the voices, what waits beneath, sketches of the lake, the tree line, and strange symbols I didn't recognize. On one page, written in letters so large they took up the entire space. They know your name. They will call you. I closed the journal and set it back on the counter. My uncle had clearly been unwell, mentally, toward the end. It was sad, really. A brilliant man. He'd been an engineer before he retreated up here, reduced to superstitious ramblings. I spent the rest of the evening unpacking my art supplies, setting up a workspace in the study where the light was best. I made a simple dinner from the canned goods I'd brought, ate while watching the last light fade from the sky, and felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in months. This was exactly what I needed. Solitude, silence, space to think and create. By 9 o'clock, I was exhausted from the drive and the unpacking. I brushed my teeth, changed into sleep clothes, and climbed into the guest room bed. The sheets smelled faintly of lavender, as if my uncle had kept them fresh even though no one ever used the room. As I lay there in the darkness, I could hear the house settling around me. The creak of old wood, the whisper of wind through the pines outside. Normal sounds, comforting sounds. I didn't think about the rules at all as I drifted off to sleep. Why would I? They were just the paranoid fantasies of a lonely, frightened old man. I would learn better soon enough. I woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through the guest room window and the sound of birds singing in the pines. For a moment I forgot where I was, then remembered with a pleasant jolt. The lake house. My lake house now. I stretched, feeling more rested than I had in months. The day passed in productive solitude. I spent the morning sketching on the porch, trying to capture the way the light played on the lake's surface. The water was a deep blue-green, clear enough that I could see rocks and logs on the bottom near the shore. A family of loons paddled past, their distinctive calls echoing across the water. By afternoon, I'd moved into the study and begun working on a canvas I'd brought with me. losing myself in the familiar rhythm of brush strokes and color mixing. I barely thought about the rules. In daylight, they seemed even more ridiculous than they had the night before. The house was beautiful, peaceful. The lake was pristine. The forest was alive with the ordinary sounds of nature. There was nothing sinister here, nothing dangerous. Just an old man's delusions. Around 4 in the afternoon, I decided to walk down to the lake shore. A narrow path led from the back of the house through the trees to a small beach of gray stones and sand. The water lapped gently at the shore. I picked up a smooth stone and skipped it across the surface. 1, 2, 3, 4 skips before it sank. As I stood there, I noticed the temperature dropping. Not dramatically, but noticeably. I looked up and saw that clouds had moved in while I'd been working. Thick gray clouds that turned the late afternoon light flat and colorless. The wind picked up, rustling through the pines with a sound like distant whispers. I should go inside, I thought, though I wasn't sure why. The rational part of my brain said it was just because of the changing weather, but there was something else. Some instinct I couldn't quite name. By the time I got back to the house, the first wisps of fog were beginning to form over the lake. I watched from the kitchen window as it rolled in, not gradually but quickly, unnaturally so. Within minutes, the lake had disappeared completely behind a wall of white mist. The fog didn't stop at the shoreline. It crept up the beach into the trees, advancing toward the house like something alive. I remembered Rule 1. Never leave the house at night, especially after the fog rolls in. It wasn't night yet. The sun wouldn't set for another hour or so, but the fog had brought premature darkness. The temperature continued to drop. I found myself closing the windows I'd opened that morning, locking them without really thinking about why. By the time I finished making dinner, pasta with jarred sauce, the fog had engulfed the house completely. I couldn't see more than a few feet beyond the windows. The world had contracted to just this structure, this small island of light and warmth surrounded by white nothingness. I tried to tell myself it was just weather. Fog was common near bodies of water, especially in the evening when the temperature differential between air and water created the right conditions. This was meteorology, not mystery. But the fog wasn't behaving like normal fog. It pressed against the windows like something with intent, swirling in patterns that seemed almost purposeful. And the silence was wrong. Complete, absolute silence. No birds, no insects, no wind. Just the muffled nothingness of the fog. I washed my dishes, dried them, put them away. I tried to read one of my uncle's books, a history of northern Minnesota logging camps, but couldn't focus. My eyes kept drifting to the windows, to the white pressure of the fog beyond the glass. At 9 o'clock, I heard it. Faint at first, so faint I thought I was imagining it. A voice coming from outside, from the woods maybe, or the lake, I couldn't tell. The fog distorted everything. The voice was calling something. I strained to hear, moving closer to the kitchen window. Evan. My blood went cold. The voice was calling my name, not shouting it, but saying it softly, almost gently. A woman's voice, I thought, though it was hard to tell. It had a strange quality, like it was coming from very far away and very close at the same time. Evan, Evan. I stepped back from the window. This was impossible. There was no one out there. The nearest neighbor was Harold Jensen, 3 miles down the road, and he was an 80-year-old man, not a woman. And no one would be wandering around in this fog anyway. It was too thick, too disorienting. Evan, please, Evan. The voice was getting louder, or closer. I couldn't tell which. My heart hammered in my chest. Every rational explanation I tried to construct fell apart. This wasn't the wind. This wasn't my imagination. Someone, something, was out there in the fog calling my name. Rule 4. If you hear your name being called in the woods, do not answer. I backed away from the window, my mouth dry. I wanted to call out, to ask who was there, to demand an explanation. The urge was almost overwhelming. But something deeper than reason stopped me. Some survival instinct that recognized danger even when my conscious mind couldn't accept it. Evan, I need you. Evan. The voice had changed. It was closer now, definitely closer. Right outside the house maybe, and it sounded wrong. The cadence was off, the inflection unnatural. Like someone who'd learned to speak by listening to recordings but had never quite mastered the rhythm of natural speech. I ran through the house, checking every door, every window, all locked, all secure. The fog pressed against the glass, and in its white depths I thought I saw shapes moving. Human-shaped, but not quite right. Too tall or too thin, or moving in ways that didn't match how bodies should move. Evan, I'm cold. Evan, let me in. Evan. The voice was right outside the front door now. I could hear it clearly, could hear the slight scratch in its tone, the way it drew out the syllables of my name. I stood in the living room, frozen, staring at the door. The handle didn't move. Nothing tried to get in. But the voice continued, patient, persistent. Evan, it's dark out here, Evan. I'm scared, Evan. Please. How long I stood there, I don't know. Minutes, hours. Time lost meaning. The voice cycled through different approaches, pleading, demanding, sweet, angry, desperate, seductive. Always my name. Always trying to get me to respond, to acknowledge it, to open the door. I don't remember making the decision to go upstairs. I found myself in the guest room, the door closed and locked, sitting on the bed with my knees pulled to my chest. Downstairs, the voice continued. I could hear it through the floorboards, muffled but persistent. On the nightstand, I'd left my phone. I grabbed it, thinking I'd call 911, call someone, call for help. But there was no signal, not even one bar. Just the empty icon, the phone useless in my shaking hands. I pulled out my uncle's journal, which I'd brought upstairs with my bag. I flipped through it by the light of the bedside lamp, looking for any explanation, any context. Near the middle, I found an entry dated 15 years ago. The fog came again tonight, thick and hungry. It called my name for 6 hours straight. 6 hours of my own voice, my mother's voice, my dead wife's voice, all begging me to come outside, to answer, to let them in. I didn't, I've learned. But God, the temptation. The voice knows exactly what to say, how to say it. It learns. It adapts. It never gives up. Rule 4 exists for a reason. Never ever answer. My hands trembled as I read. My uncle hadn't been crazy. He'd been trying to warn me. The rules weren't superstition, they were survival. Downstairs, the voice had changed tactics again. Now it was crying, sobbing my name between hitched breaths. Evan. Please, I'm hurt. Evan, I need help. Evan. I wanted to cover my ears, to block it out, but I forced myself to listen, to endure it. Because responding would be worse. Somehow I knew that with absolute certainty. If I answered, if I acknowledged it, something terrible would happen. The rule wasn't arbitrary, it was a boundary, a line that couldn't be crossed. The night stretched on. The voice continued, tireless, relentless. Sometimes it was a woman, sometimes a man, sometimes a child. Always my name, always trying to pull me outside, into the fog, into whatever waited there. I didn't sleep. I sat on that bed, reading my uncle's journal entry by entry, learning the truth about the place I'd inherited. About the lake, about the fog, about the things that lived in the space between. When dawn finally came, it came slowly. The darkness giving way to gray. The gray to pale light. The fog began to thin, retreating back toward the lake like something called home. The voice stopped mid-sentence, cutting off as cleanly as if someone had flipped a switch. I waited until full daylight before I went downstairs. The house was exactly as I'd left it, doors locked, windows secure, nothing disturbed. In the growing light of morning, I could almost convince myself I'd imagined it all, that it had been some kind of exhaustion-induced hallucination. But I hadn't imagined it. I knew that. Just as I knew that last night had been a test, and I'd passed. Barely. I spent the next 2 days in a state of careful vigilance. I painted during daylight hours, worked on sketches, tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. But every action was calculated around the rules now. I locked windows well before sunset. I stayed inside once the light began to fade. I kept the journal close, reading and rereading my uncle's entries, trying to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with. The fog came each night, though not always with the voice. Sometimes it simply pressed against the house in silence, waiting. I learned to sleep through it, or at least to rest, though my dreams were troubled and strange. On the third day, Claire called. We'd been friends since college. She'd been an art history major while I focused on studio arts, and she'd helped me through the worst of my recent struggles with encouragement and occasional financial support she claimed was just loans between friends. She was visiting family in Duluth, about 2 hours south, and wanted to drive up to see the lake house. "I need to make sure you're not living in some serial killer shack," she said with a laugh. "Plus, I want to see if there's anything worth appraising. Your uncle might have had some valuable pieces squirreled away." I should have said no. I should have made up an excuse, told her I wasn't ready for visitors, claimed I was sick or the road was impassable or something. But the truth was, after 3 days of solitude punctuated by supernatural fog and disembodied voices, I was desperate for normal human contact. For someone who existed in the regular world, who would remind me that reality was still out there, still functioning according to rules I understood. Claire arrived Saturday afternoon, her silver Subaru kicking up dust as it navigated the long driveway. She emerged wearing hiking boots, jeans, and a wool sweater. Her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She looked exactly like what she was, a successful professional from the city, slumming it in the wilderness for the weekend. "Evan!" She pulled me into a hug that smelled of expensive perfume and coffee. "Look at you. You've already got that rugged outdoor artist thing going. Very sexy." I laughed despite myself and helped her carry her overnight bag inside. She toured the house with the critical eye of someone who attended too many estate sales, commenting on the quality of the furniture, the potential value of some of my uncle's books, the authentic vintage charm of the kitchen appliances. "This place is incredible," she said, standing on the porch and looking out at the lake. "God, it's so quiet. How do you stand it?" "You get used to it," I said. That evening, I made dinner while Claire regaled me with stories from her job at a Minneapolis art gallery. Drama about artists, collectors, and the endless hustle of the art world. It felt wonderful, normal, like the fog and the voice had been nothing but bad dreams. We ate on the porch as the sun set, the sky turning brilliant shades of orange and purple. Claire opened a bottle of wine she'd brought and poured us each a glass. "So," she said, leaning back in her chair, "have you been working? Is the solitude helping?" I told her about the paintings I'd started, the sketches, the way the landscape here was different from anything I'd tried to capture before. I didn't mention the rules, I didn't mention the fog. But Claire had noticed the journal on the kitchen counter. "What's that?" she asked, pointing through the window. "Oh, it's just... my uncle left some notes about the property." "Can I see?" Before I could stop her, she'd gone inside and grabbed it. I followed, my heart sinking as she opened to the page with the rules. She read for a moment, then burst out laughing. "Oh my God, Evan. Never leave the house at night. Don't open the attic door. This is hilarious. Your uncle was quite the character. Claire. No, seriously. This is like every urban legend ever. I'm surprised there's not a rule about not looking in mirrors or not counting the windows. She was flipping through the pages now, reading excerpts aloud in a mock-serious voice. They know your name. They will call you. Jesus, did he write horror stories as a hobby? Claire, just put it back, okay? She looked at me, really looked at me, and her amusement faded slightly. Evan, you're not taking this seriously, are you? I just think we should respect. Respect what? The paranoid delusions of an old man who died alone in the woods. Her voice was kind but firm, the tone she used when she thought I was being self-destructive. This is exactly what you don't need. You came up here to escape stress, not to get caught up in supernatural nonsense. I wanted to tell her about the fog, about the voice, about the 3 nights I'd spent locked in the house while something outside called my name. But I could see the look in her eyes, concern tinged with pity. She'd think I was having a breakdown. Maybe I was. You're right, I said finally. It's just strange being in someone else's space. There are things all around. Claire smiled and squeezed my shoulder. Totally normal. You need to make this place your own, not live in your uncle's shadow. She set the journal down. Now I noticed a canoe down by the water. What do you say we go for an evening paddle? The lake looks gorgeous. My stomach dropped. It's almost sunset. So that's the best time, the light is perfect. She was already heading for the door. Claire, wait. But she was outside, heading down the path to the lake with the confidence of someone who'd grown up with a cabin on Lake Superior. Someone who knew boats and water and wasn't afraid of either. I grabbed the journal and followed, my mind racing. Rule 1. Never leave the house at night. But it wasn't night yet. The sun was still visible on the horizon, maybe 15 minutes of daylight left. Rule 3. If the lake seems still and the water goes black, stay inside. The lake looked normal, its surface rippling slightly in the evening breeze. Maybe it would be okay. Maybe the rules only applied when I was alone. Maybe Claire was right and I'd been working myself into a paranoid state. By the time I reached the shore, Claire had already dragged the old aluminum canoe into the water. It was scarred and dented but appeared seaworthy. 2 paddles lay inside. Come on, she called. Stop being such a hermit. I should have refused. I should have physically restrained her, dragged her back to the house, locked us both inside. But I didn't. The social pressure, the embarrassment of seeming crazy, the desperate hope that maybe the rules were just coincidence and superstition after all. I climbed into the canoe. We paddled out from shore, Claire in the front, me in the back. The water was calm, reflecting the dying light like hammered copper. Around us, the forest stood dark and still. No birds sang. I realized that suddenly, there were no birds, no insects, no sound except the dip and pull of our paddles. See, Claire said over her shoulder, this is beautiful, this is what you should be painting. We were maybe 100 yards from shore when I noticed the wind had stopped. Completely stopped. The surface of the lake became glass smooth, our canoe gliding across it without a ripple. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in as many seconds. Claire, we need to go back. Oh, come on, we just got out here. Claire, I'm serious, look at the water. She looked down and I watched her expression change. The water beneath us was darkening, not gradually but rapidly, as if something was rising from the depths. The copper reflection faded to black. Within seconds we were floating on water the color of oil, so dark it seemed to swallow light. Rule 3. If the lake seems still and the water goes black, stay inside. What the hell? Claire's voice had lost its confidence. Is this algae? Some kind of bloom? We need to go back, now. I dug my paddle in and pulled hard, turning us toward shore. Claire joined me, both of us stroking in unison, moving as quickly as we could. But we'd drifted farther out than I'd realized. The shore was at least 200 yards away, and the house looked small in the gathering dusk. Fog began forming on the water, not rolling in from a distance, but simply appearing, materializing out of the black lake itself. In seconds, visibility dropped to a few yards, then a few feet. Evan, I can't see the shore. Just keep paddling straight. But straight was impossible to judge. The fog disoriented everything, and the black water gave no reference points. We could have been going in circles for all I knew. That's when we heard the voice. Claire. Not my name this time. Hers. Coming from somewhere in the fog, from the water, from everywhere and nowhere. Claire stopped paddling. Did you hear that? Don't answer, I hissed. On whatever you do, don't answer. Claire, over here, Claire. Someone's out here, Claire said, her voice shaking. Someone's in the water. No, they're not. It's not a person, just paddle. But Claire was staring into the fog, her paddle slack in her hands. It sounds like my sister. Her sister Emma had drowned when they were teenagers, caught in a riptide at a beach in California. Claire rarely talked about it, but I knew it had shaped her life in profound ways. Claire, I'm cold. Claire, help me. Emma? Claire's voice was barely a whisper. Claire, no, it's not her. But Claire was leaning over the side of the canoe, peering into the black water, her hand reaching down toward the surface. Emma? Is that you? Claire, stop! I lunged forward, grabbing her shoulder, pulling her back. The canoe rocked violently. Claire fought against me, surprisingly strong, her eyes fixed on the water. She's down there, I can see her. Emma's down there. I looked. In the black water, shapes moved, human-shaped but wrong, pale forms undulating just beneath the surface. And faces, God, the faces, pressing up against the water like hands against glass, mouths open, eyes empty. Something brushed against the bottom of the canoe. Then again, harder. The entire boat shuddered. Paddle! I screamed. Paddle now! The spell broke. Claire grabbed her paddle and we stroked together frantically as things bumped and scraped against the hull. The canoe rocked with each impact, water sloshing over the sides. A hand, pale, bloated, fingers too long, broke the surface next to Claire. She shrieked and hammered at it with her paddle. The hand grabbed the gunwale, pulling down. More hands appeared, dozens of them, all reaching, grasping, trying to tip us over. I struck at them with my paddle, feeling the sickening give of cold flesh. Claire was screaming, hitting the water and the hands and anything she could reach. The canoe tipped dangerously, water pouring over one side. Then through the fog ahead I saw lights. The house. We'd somehow stayed on course. There! Go! We paddled with everything we had. The hands fell away one by one as we entered shallower water. 20 yards from shore, 10, 5. The canoe's bottom scraped on rocks and sand, and we both scrambled out, splashing through knee-deep water, running up the beach and up the path toward the house. Behind us, the voice called, mournful and angry. Claire, why did you leave? Claire, come back. Claire. We burst through the back door and I slammed it shut, throwing the deadbolt. Claire collapsed against the wall, soaking wet, gasping. I ran through the house, checking every door, every window, making sure everything was locked. By the time I returned to the kitchen, full dark had fallen outside. The fog pressed against the windows, and the voice had multiplied. No longer just one voice, but many, a chorus of them calling both our names in broken harmony. Claire, Evan, come outside. Claire, Evan, let us in. Claire, Evan. Claire was staring at me, her face pale, mascara running with lake water and tears. What the fuck was that? What the fuck is this place? I picked up the journal from where it had fallen and handed it to her. Read it, I said. All of it. And then you'll understand. The rules aren't superstition, Claire. They're survival. She took the journal with shaking hands and began to read while outside the voices sang their terrible song. Claire read through the night while I sat beside her, both of us perched on the living room couch, the journal spread across our laps. Outside, the voices continued their pleading chorus, but they couldn't reach us. Not as long as we stayed inside. Not as long as we followed the rules. My uncle's journal was more extensive than I'd initially realized. What I'd thought were random paranoid entries were actually years of careful documentation. Daniel Reed had been many things, but crazy wasn't one of them. He'd been methodical, scientific almost in his observations and recordings. The earliest entries dated back 42 years to when he'd first inherited the house from his own uncle. Back then, he'd been skeptical too. The entries from those first weeks were dismissive, even mocking. But gradually, as incident piled upon incident, his tone changed from skepticism to concern, to something approaching terror, and finally, years later, to a kind of grim acceptance. "Listen to this," Claire said, her voice hoarse. She'd stopped shaking but still looked pale, traumatized. She read aloud from an entry dated 30 years prior. "I've been researching the history of Lake Miriam in the county archives. The lake wasn't always called Miriam. That's a relatively recent name from the 1920s. Before that, the Ojibwe who lived in this area called it Anamiki Zaga Igan, which roughly translates to Thunderer Lake or Spirit Lake. I found a reference in a missionary's journal from 1847 that mentions the lake was considered forbidden ground, a place where the boundary between the living world and the spirit world was thin. The missionary wrote about his attempts to convert the local Ojibwe and how they refused to build near the lake despite its abundant fish and clear water. They told him the lake was hungry and that it took people who disrespected it. The missionary dismissed this as superstition naturally. He built a small chapel on the south shore to demonstrate that Christian faith conquered heathen fears. According to the records, the chapel burned down 3 months later. The missionary and his family were never found. Claire looked up at me. "Your uncle really went down the rabbit hole with this. Keep reading." She flipped ahead several pages, scanning entries, stopping occasionally to read passages aloud. My uncle had documented everything: the patterns of the fog, the timing of the voices, the phases of the moon that seemed to correlate with increased activity. He'd noted that the voices never repeated the same phrases exactly, that they learned and adapted using information they shouldn't have had access to. He'd recorded the names of others who'd lived near the lake, and how many of them had disappeared or died under mysterious circumstances. But it was the entries about the house itself that caught my attention. "Here," I said, pointing to a passage about halfway through the journal. Claire read it silently, her eyes widening, then read it aloud. "The house is a threshold, but also a barrier. I've come to understand this through painful experience. My grandfather built this house in 1923, right after the last resident of the lakeshore disappeared. He chose this spot deliberately, not for the view or the land, but because of something he'd found, something he buried in the foundation. In his own notes, which I found hidden in the attic, he wrote about a deal he'd made, not with God and not with the devil, at least not the Christian devil, with something older. Something that had been here long before Europeans arrived, probably before humans at all. The house stands on a point of power, a nexus. The things in the lake can't cross its threshold without permission. But they can call to us, they can tempt us, and they can take us if we venture out into their domain after dark. The attic contains the heart of this protection. My grandfather called it the anchor. I've been up there only once, and once was enough. What I saw there, what's still there, is not meant to be disturbed. Rule 2 exists for a reason. The attic door must stay locked. Claire set down the journal. The attic. We need to see what's in the attic. No, I said immediately. Absolutely not. You saw what happened on the lake. The rules work. We follow them. Evan, don't you want to understand? Don't you want to know what we're dealing with? My uncle knew what we're dealing with, and he says stay out of the attic. Your uncle also lived here alone for 40 years and died of a heart attack at 68. Maybe, and I'm just putting this out there, maybe constant terror and isolation aren't great life choices. She had a point, though I didn't want to admit it. So what are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that knowledge is power. If we understand what your grandfather did, what the anchor is, maybe we can find a better solution than just hiding in here for the rest of your life. A better solution like what? I don't know. Breaking the curse? Closing the door permanently? Moving to literally anywhere else? She gestured at the windows where dawn was finally beginning to break, the fog thinning in the gray light. You can't stay here, Evan. Not like this. And I can't leave you here knowing what's out there. We argued for another hour as the sun climbed higher, burning away the fog. Claire wanted to open the attic immediately. I wanted to leave the entire thing alone, to follow the rules exactly as my uncle had. We compromised, sort of. We'd spend the day researching, reading more of the journal, trying to understand the fuller context before making any decisions. The journal contained over 300 pages of entries. We divided it up and read systematically, taking notes, cross-referencing dates and events. A picture began to emerge, and it wasn't comforting. Lake Miriam, or whatever it had been called before, had a long history of disappearances. My uncle had compiled records going back to the 1830s. People vanished near the lake with disturbing regularity. Sometimes their bodies were found days or weeks later, drowned, always with expressions of terror frozen on their faces. Sometimes they were never found at all. The patterns were consistent. The disappearances happened most frequently in spring and fall, during periods of fog and mist. They often involved people who were new to the area, who didn't know the unspoken rules that locals observed. And they always involved the lake itself, the water, the fog, the voices. My grandfather, Jeremiah Reed, had lost his younger brother to the lake in 1922. The brother had been swimming on a calm summer evening and simply didn't come back up. His body was found 3 days later, 5 miles down the shore despite the lack of current in the lake. According to the journal, this loss had driven Jeremiah to seek answers, to research the lake's history and the beliefs of the indigenous people who'd once lived here. What Jeremiah had learned and what he'd done with that knowledge was recorded in a separate set of papers my uncle mentioned finding in the attic. But my uncle's descriptions of those papers were vague, as if he was reluctant to document the details even in his private journal. What's in the attic cannot be fully explained in words, he'd written. It has to be seen to be understood. But seeing it comes with a cost. The knowledge itself creates a bond, a responsibility. Jeremiah understood this. He spent the last 30 years of his life maintaining the anchor, feeding it, keeping the barrier strong. When he died, that responsibility passed to my father and then to me. I have no children. When I die, the responsibility will pass to whoever inherits this house. I'm sorry, Evan, I'm so sorry. But I couldn't let the house fall into the hands of someone who wouldn't understand, who wouldn't respect what needs to be done. You're smart, you're observant, you'll figure it out. And you'll do what needs to be done because you're family, and this burden is our family's alone. Jesus, Claire whispered after reading that passage. He knew. He knew he was trapping you here. I felt sick. He said I could sell it. In his note, he said I could sell it if I wanted. But you can't, though, can you? Not without explaining to the buyer that the lake is cursed and they'll need to follow a bizarre set of rules or die. Who would buy that? And even if someone did, could you live with yourself knowing what would happen to them? She was right. I was trapped, just as my uncle had been trapped, just as my grandfather had been trapped. The house wasn't an inheritance, it was a prison sentence. There has to be another way, I said. Claire looked at the attic door, or rather at the ceiling since we couldn't see it from the living room. Maybe there is. Maybe the answer is up there. Or maybe we open that door and make everything worse. How could it be worse than this? I couldn't answer that, but deep in my gut I knew it could be worse. Rule 2 existed for a reason, just like all the others. My uncle had learned the rules the hard way, he'd written. I didn't know what that meant, not exactly, but I knew I didn't want to repeat his mistakes. Still, Claire's question haunted me. How long could I live like this? Locked in the house every night, listening to voices call my name, knowing that one mistake, one moment of weakness or forgetfulness could cost me everything. Days, months, years, the rest of my life. That afternoon, while Claire napped on the couch, exhausted from a sleepless night, I went upstairs alone. I stood in the hallway between the two bedrooms, looking at the attic door. Up close, I could see details I'd missed before. The door wasn't just painted to match the walls, it was carved with symbols, intricate patterns that had been filled with paint but were still visible as slight depressions in the wood. Some of the symbols looked vaguely like letters from various alphabets, Greek, Hebrew, maybe Sanskrit. Others were purely geometric, complex interlocking shapes that made my eyes hurt if I looked at them too long. I pressed my ear against the door. Silence. But not empty silence. A muffled, waiting silence like the inside of a held breath. I tried the handle. Locked, as I'd discovered before, neither of my keys fit. The keyhole was old-fashioned, the kind that required a skeleton key. I checked the obvious places, the hook by the back door where other keys hung, the drawer in the kitchen, my uncle's bedroom nightstand. Nothing. Where would my uncle have hidden the key to the one door he never wanted opened? The answer came to me as I stood in his bedroom looking at his belongings. He wouldn't have hidden it. He would have kept it close, kept it safe, kept it with him. I'd left my uncle's personal effects in a box the lawyer had given me, his wallet, his watch, his wedding ring from a marriage that had ended in divorce 40 years ago. I retrieved the box from the closet and dumped it on the bed. The key was there, attached to a chain my uncle had apparently worn around his neck. It was brass, old, ornate, and it fit perfectly in the attic door's lock. I stood there for a long moment, the key in the lock, unturned. This was the line. I could turn away, put the key back, try to live with the rules as my uncle had, or I could turn it, open the door, and learn what 3 generations of my family had been hiding. Claire's voice came from downstairs. "Evan, where are you?" I turned the key. The lock clicked with a sound like breaking bones. The door swung inward on silent hinges, revealing a steep, narrow staircase climbing into darkness. Cold air flowed down from above, carrying a smell that was both organic and metallic, like earth and old blood. "Evan?" Claire's footsteps on the stairs. "What are you doing?" "I found the key," I said, not looking away from the dark above. She appeared beside me, still bleary-eyed from sleep, and went very still. "Oh." "We wanted answers," I said. "I think they're up there." We stood together in silence, looking into the dark. Then Claire reached out and found the switch for the attic light. It clicked on with a buzz, illuminating the stairs. "Together?" she asked. "Together?" We climbed into the attic, and nothing would ever be the same. The attic was larger than I'd expected, spanning the full footprint of the house. Light came from bare bulbs strung along the rafters, casting harsh shadows across a space that seemed to exist outside normal geometry. The walls slanted at odd angles. The corners didn't quite meet properly. Looking at it too long made my vision swim. But it was what occupied the center of the attic that stopped us both in our tracks. A circle, maybe 15 feet in diameter, had been drawn, or carved, or burned into the wooden floor. Within the circle, symbols covered every inch of space, overlapping and interweaving in patterns that hurt to look at directly. At the cardinal points of the circle, objects had been placed. To the north, a human skull, yellowed with age. To the east, what looked like a large crystal or chunk of quartz. To the south, a bowl filled with something dark and crusted. To the west, a bundle of feathers and bones tied with sinew. And in the center, rising from the floor like a pillar of twisted metal and stone, was the anchor. I don't know how else to describe it. It wasn't entirely physical. Parts of it seemed to fade in and out of visibility, as if it existed partially in some other dimension. The base was definitely metal, iron maybe, black with age, worked into spiraling patterns. But as it rose, it became less solid, more like smoke or shadow, until at its apex it dispersed into something I couldn't see or understand, something my eyes simply refused to process. The air around it vibrated with a low frequency I felt more than heard, a buzzing that resonated in my teeth and bones. "My God," Claire whispered, "what is it?" I stepped closer, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name. The symbols on the floor seemed to pulse in rhythm with the vibration, and I realized they weren't painted or carved. They were burned into the wood, and they were glowing faintly with their own light. On the floor near the circle, I found more of my grandfather's papers, protected in plastic sleeves and weighed down with stones. I knelt and began reading by the light of the nearest bulb. The papers were a mix of handwritten notes and typed pages, diagrams and sketches, newspaper clippings, and what looked like pages torn from very old books. The handwriting was precise, obsessive, the work of someone who'd spent years perfecting something terrible. The anchor works by principle of sympathy and antipathy, my grandfather had written. The lake, the entity within the lake, is drawn to certain frequencies of life and consciousness. It feeds on them, not in a physical sense, but in a spiritual one. It consumes identity, memory, self. This is why the drowned are found empty-eyed, why those taken by the fog are never quite right if they return at all. The anchor creates a counter-frequency, a resonance that repels rather than attracts. But such a thing cannot exist without fuel. A barrier requires constant maintenance, constant sacrifice. Not of life, I am not a murderer, but of time, of attention, of will. The anchor must be tended, fed with intent and purpose. This is the burden of the keeper. I will maintain it for as long as I live, and when I die, another must take my place. This is the covenant, the unspoken agreement made when this house was built. The house stands as a barrier, the keeper tends the anchor, and the lake remains contained. There was more, pages and pages of technical details about the symbols, the objects, the specific rituals required to maintain the anchor. My hands shook as I read about the feeding, a daily practice of meditation and will, of projecting intent into the anchor, of keeping the barrier strong through pure mental discipline. My uncle had done this, every day for decades, and before him, my father, though he'd apparently been less dedicated, which had led to incidents my uncle had needed to correct. And before him, Jeremiah, the creator who'd given 30 years of his life to keeping the anchor active after watching his brother die. "Evan," Claire said, her voice tight, "look at this." She was pointing to one of the walls where my uncle had pinned a series of newspaper clippings. I joined her and began reading. The clippings spanned decades from the 1960s to just a few years ago. Each one documented a death or disappearance connected to Lake Miriam. 1967, young couple drowns during evening swim despite being experienced swimmers. 1972, fisherman found dead in boat, no signs of trauma, expression described as terrified. 1985, 2 children vanished during family camping trip, bodies found a week later in the lake despite extensive searches of the water. 1993, woman drives car into lake, survives crash but drowns in 3 feet of water. 2003, hiker disappears from trail, found drowned in lake 5 miles from trail. 2018, teenager drowns during party. Friends report he was standing on shore one moment, in the water the next, like something pulled him in. Each clipping had a notation in my uncle's handwriting. Next to the 1985 entry, failed to perform feeding ritual for 6 days due to illness. Children paid the price. Next to the 2003 entry, anchor weakening, need to reinforce. Next to the 2018 entry, I'm getting old. Maintenance is becoming difficult, need to find successor. He blamed himself, I said. For all of them. Maybe he should have, Claire said, and there was anger in her voice. Maybe instead of keeping this secret, performing these insane rituals, he should have warned people, put up signs, closed the lake, and told them what? That there's an evil lake monster. That would go over well. Better than letting people die. People die near water all the time, Claire. Lakes, rivers, oceans, they're all dangerous. How many of these were actually the lake's fault? And how many were just normal drownings that my uncle convinced himself were supernatural? But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. Not after what we'd experienced. Not after the voices, the hands in the water, the black lake. A sound from below made us both freeze. The front door. Someone was knocking. We hurried down the attic stairs, and I locked the door behind us, some instinct telling me the anchor shouldn't be left exposed before heading downstairs. Through the front window, I could see an old pickup truck in the driveway and an elderly man on the porch. I opened the door to find a man who had to be pushing 80, tall and thin, wearing canvas work pants and a flannel shirt despite the cool weather. His face was weathered like driftwood, his eyes a startling pale blue. "You must be Evan," he said. His voice was rough like gravel underfoot. "I'm Harold Jensen. I live down the road. I knew your uncle." "Mr. Jensen, please come in." He stepped inside, removing his cap, and his eyes immediately found Claire. "Ma'am," then to me. "I apologize for not coming by sooner. I wanted to give you time to settle, but I saw what happened last night." "You saw?" "The fog. The canoe. Stupid thing to do, going out on the water at dusk." He said it without judgment, just stating fact. "But you made it back, so maybe you're not completely foolish." Claire bristled. "We didn't know." "You know now," Harold interrupted. "That's what matters. Daniel tried to warn you, I expect. He leave you the rules?" "Yes," I said. "But we didn't. I didn't take them seriously enough." Harold nodded slowly. "Most don't at first. Takes an encounter to make believers. May I sit? This old back doesn't like standing too long." We settled in the living room, Harold in my uncle's worn leather chair, Claire and I on the couch. For a moment he just looked around the room, his expression nostalgic and sad. "I knew your uncle for 43 years, he finally said. "Moved here with my wife in '78, bought the place 3 miles down the road. Daniel was already here, already keeping watch. We became friends as much as he'd allow. He was always distant, always carrying that weight." "You know about the anchor?" I asked. Harold's eyebrows rose. "You've been in the attic, that was quick. Daniel lasted 6 months before curiosity got him." He sighed. "Yes, I know about the anchor. Your uncle told me eventually. Needed someone who could check on him, someone who could continue the work if something happened. Did you ever, I started. Tend it? No. That's family business. The anchor responds to blood, to lineage. I'm an outsider. Best I could do was keep an eye on things, warn off tourists, make sure people respected the rules even if they didn't know why. He leaned forward, his pale eyes intense. Your uncle gave 40 years to this place, Evan. 40 years of his life, every single day, feeding that thing up there, keeping the barrier strong. It aged him. The work, the isolation, the constant vigilance. He was 68 when he died, but he looked 90. Why? Claire demanded. Why didn't he just leave? Why didn't he let someone else deal with it, or just let the anchor fail? Harold turned to her. Because of what would happen if he did. You've seen what the lake does when the barrier is strong, when the anchor is maintained. The voices, the fog, the hands in the water. Now imagine what it would do if the barrier fell. If the thing in the lake was no longer contained. What thing? I asked. What exactly is in the lake? I don't know, Harold said, and the admission seemed to pain him. Daniel didn't know. Your grandfather didn't know. The Ojibwe knew maybe, but they're not sharing that knowledge with outsiders, and I can't blame them. What I do know is that it's old, it's hungry, and it's been contained to this lake for a long time. The anchor keeps it here, keeps it weak. Without it, he trailed off. Without it what? Claire pressed. Without it, the fog spreads. The voices carry farther, the drownings increase, and eventually, whatever's in the lake finds a way out. Harold stood, his joints creaking. I've said my piece. The rest is up to you. But understand this. Your uncle died doing this work, and he considered it a worthy sacrifice. Not for himself, but for everyone else. For the hikers and fishermen, for the families with summer cabins, for the people who just want to swim in a lake without being dragged to the bottom. He moved toward the door, then paused. One more thing. If you decide you can't do this, if you're going to walk away, tell me first. Give me time to warn people, to evacuate the area as best I can. Don't just leave the anchor to fail. After he'd driven away, Claire and I sat in silence for a long time. He's wrong, Claire finally said. This isn't your responsibility. You didn't ask for this. No one asks for responsibility, I said. It just happens. Evan, I need to think, I said. Just give me time to think. But I already knew what I was going to do, and so did she. Claire stayed for 2 more days, both of us dancing around the central question neither wanted to address. What was I going to do? The journal sat on the kitchen counter. The key to the attic hung on a chain around my neck, and every sunset brought the fog rolling in with its chorus of voices. But something had changed. Now that I understood what the voices were, manifestations of something ancient and hungry pressing against the barrier my family maintained, they seemed less terrifying and more tragic. The voices weren't angry. They were desperate, lonely, hungry in a way that went beyond physical need. I began following my grandfather's instructions, performing the feeding ritual. It wasn't complicated, not really. Each morning at dawn, I climbed to the attic, stood at the edge of the circle, and focused my mind on the anchor. I thought about boundaries and barriers, about containment and control. I projected my will into the symbol-scarred floor, into the twisted pillar of metal and shadow, imagining it growing stronger, its frequency intensifying. It felt ridiculous at first, like pretending to be a wizard from a fantasy novel. But by the 3rd morning, I could feel something responding. The anchor vibrated differently when I concentrated on it. The light of the symbols brightened fractionally. And that evening, the fog seemed thinner, the voices more distant. "You're really doing this," Claire said on the evening before she left. We were sitting on the porch, watching the sun set over the lake. The fog was just beginning to form, wisps of white rising from the darkening water. I don't see what choice I have. You have every choice. You could sell this place unto who, knowing what I know. You could walk away, just leave. Let someone else. Let someone else die? I shook my head. You heard Harold. If the anchor fails and it gets worse. Spreads. I can't have that on my conscience. Claire was quiet for a long moment, watching the fog thicken. You know what this means, right? This is your life now. Every day. Forever. Until you die. Just like your uncle. Maybe I'll find another way. Some way to resolve this, to end it. Or maybe you'll end up like Daniel, alone in the woods, sacrificing everything for something no one will ever thank you for. Probably, I admitted. But at least I'll know I did something that mattered. She left the next morning, and I could see in her eyes that she thought I was making a mistake, that I was letting some misguided sense of family obligation trap me. Maybe she was right. But as I stood on the porch and watched her car disappear down the driveway, kicking up dust that caught the morning light, I felt a strange sense of peace. I had a purpose now. It wasn't the purpose I'd imagined for myself. I'd wanted to be an artist, to create beauty, to make something that would outlast me. But this was creation too, in a way. I was maintaining something my grandfather had built, continuing work that had protected people for nearly a century. The days fell into a rhythm. Wake at dawn, perform the feeding ritual, eat breakfast. Paint or sketch during the day, work on projects, try to maintain some semblance of the life I'd planned. As the sun began to set, lock all the windows, secure all the doors, retreat inside the barrier. Listen to the fog and the voices, but remain separate from them, safe behind the walls my family had built. It should have been sustainable. It should have worked. But there was a problem I hadn't fully appreciated, something my uncle's journal had mentioned, but I hadn't understood until I experienced it myself. The anchor didn't just need attention. It needed intention. It needed belief. And the longer I performed the ritual, the more doubts began to creep in. Was I really doing anything? The ritual felt like meditation, like self-hypnosis. Yes, the anchor seemed to respond, but maybe that was just my imagination, my brain filling in patterns that weren't there. Yes, the fog seemed thinner some nights, but weather was variable. Maybe that was just meteorology, not mysticism. The rational part of my brain, the part that had been trained by years of education to question, to doubt, to demand evidence, began to undermine the work. And as my belief wavered, so did the anchor's strength. 3 weeks after Claire left, I woke to find frost on the windows despite it being only October, far too early for freezing temperatures. The house was cold, colder than the heating system could account for, and in the attic, when I went to perform the feeding, the symbols on the floor had dimmed to barely visible, and the anchor itself seemed less solid, more like smoke. That night, the fog came heavier than it had since the first week. It pressed against the house like something solid, and the voices were loud. So loud I could hear them clearly, even in the center of the house with all the windows closed. Evan, let us in. Evan, we're cold. Evan, we need you. But worse than the voices was the knocking. Physical knocking on the doors, the windows, the walls. Something was testing the barrier, probing for weaknesses. I spent the night in the attic, sitting within the circle, trying to pour every ounce of will and belief into the anchor. I recited the words my grandfather had written, focused on the images he'd described, did everything the instructions specified. But it wasn't enough. The doubt was too strong, the rational voice too loud. By dawn, I was exhausted. The anchor was weaker than ever, and I knew I couldn't continue this way. There had to be another answer, some way to strengthen the anchor, or some way to end this that didn't require my constant, perfect faith. My grandfather's papers had mentioned other things, hints at deeper research, references to sources he'd consulted. Maybe those sources held answers. The problem was most of those sources were in the attic in boxes I hadn't fully explored, and according to my grandfather's notes, some of them were dangerous in their own right. Books that shouldn't be read, documents that carried their own curses, objects that had power beyond their physical forms. Rule 2. Do not open the attic door. But I'd already broken that rule, hadn't I? I'd opened the door, seen the anchor, read the papers. How much worse could it be to dig deeper, to search for answers among the boxes and trunks my grandfather had stored up there? The rationalization came easily, too easily. I told myself I was being practical, that understanding the full scope of the situation would help me maintain the anchor better. I told myself I was doing research, being thorough, that this was what my grandfather would have wanted. I didn't admit, even to myself, that what I really wanted was a way out. I spent the next several days in the attic, going through my grandfather's collection. It was extensive, disturbing, and absolutely fascinating. Books in languages I couldn't read, some in alphabets I didn't recognize. Journals from previous owners of the property going back to the 1870s. Sketches and diagrams of the lake with notations about active sites and weak points in the membrane. Photographs of the lake from different eras, and in many of them, if you looked closely, you could see shapes in the water, faces pressing against the surface. And in the very back, in a locked trunk I had to break open with a crowbar, I found my grandfather's most dangerous research. His attempts to communicate with the thing in the lake. The documents were terrifying in their scientific precision. Jeremiah had approached the entity like a researcher studying a new species, documenting its responses to different stimuli, its patterns of behavior, its methods of communication. He'd developed a system, a kind of language, based on the symbols carved into the attic floor. And he'd learned things. The entity wasn't malicious, not exactly. It was hungry, but not for flesh or blood. It fed on consciousness, on the electrical patterns of thought and memory that made up human identity. When it took someone, it consumed their sense of self, leaving the body intact but the person gone. The drowned were found empty because they'd been eaten from the inside out. But the entity wasn't mindless. It was intelligent, probably far more intelligent than humans. And it had been trapped in the lake for a very long time, bound there by forces Jeremiah couldn't fully understand but suspected were connected to the land itself, to something the indigenous peoples had done centuries or millennia ago. The anchor didn't trap it, it was already trapped. The anchor kept it weak, kept it from extending its influence beyond the lake's immediate area, kept it from drawing people to the water as strongly as it otherwise could. And here was the crucial part, the thing that changed everything. The anchor could fail, was designed to fail, eventually. My grandfather had written about this in his final notes in shaking handwriting that suggested he'd been terrified by what he'd discovered. The anchor is not a permanent solution. It was never meant to be. It's a delaying tactic, a way to buy time to keep the entity contained until a real solution could be found. But we've spent nearly a century just maintaining the delay, and we're no closer to a real answer than we were in 1923. The anchor is weakening with each generation. My father's will was stronger than mine. Mine is stronger than Daniel's will be. And eventually someone in our line will be born without enough strength to maintain it. When that happens, the barrier will fail and the entity will be free to extend its influence. We need a permanent solution, not containment, but elimination. Not feeding the anchor, but destroying the entity itself. But I don't know how. I've spent 30 years searching for an answer and found nothing but ways to delay the inevitable. I sat in the attic, surrounded by my grandfather's life work, and realized the truth. I was already failing. 3 weeks, and I couldn't maintain the anchor effectively. How was I supposed to do this for years? Decades? The rest of my life? I needed to find another way. That's when I made my mistake. That's when I broke the most important rule of all. In my grandfather's trunk, beneath all the journals and documents, I found a book. Not a published book, but a handwritten grimoire, bound in what I desperately hoped was leather but suspected was something else. The cover was blank, but inside, written in English interspersed with symbols and diagrams, were instructions. Instructions for communication, for negotiation, for making deals. The entity is not irrational, my grandfather had written in the margins. It can be reasoned with. It has done this before with the indigenous peoples, with earlier settlers. Agreements can be made, prices can be paid. There are options beyond eternal vigilance. I should have stopped reading. I should have closed the book, locked it back in the trunk, walked away. But I didn't. I kept reading, page after page, learning the method of contact, the ritual of negotiation, the price of communication. It required breaking the barrier. Briefly, in a controlled way, but breaking it nonetheless. Opening a channel through which the entity could reach through, could speak through, could make its desires known. It required going to the lake at night, standing at the water's edge as the fog rolled in, speaking the words of invitation. It required breaking every rule I'd been given. But if I could negotiate, if I could find some arrangement that didn't require my constant attention, my perfect faith, my entire life, wasn't that worth the risk? The rationalization was seductive. I spent 3 more days studying the book, learning the ritual, convincing myself this was the right course of action. I told myself I was being smart, strategic, that I was finding a solution rather than just accepting the burden. I didn't let myself consider that my grandfather had written these instructions but had never followed them himself, that there might be a reason he'd chosen eternal vigilance over negotiation. I didn't let myself remember that every horror story about making deals with unknown entities ended badly. I just focused on the possibility of freedom, of a life beyond this house and this lake and this terrible responsibility. On the night of the new moon, when my grandfather's note said the barrier was thinnest, I walked down to the lake. The fog was waiting. I should have known the moment I stepped outside. The fog didn't roll in gradually. It was simply there, as if it had been waiting, as if it had known I was coming. The air temperature dropped so sharply I could see my breath, and the silence was absolute. No insects, no birds, no wind, just the fog and the dark water and me. The ritual required standing at the water's edge, at the exact spot where my uncle's canoe had been kept. I pulled it farther onto the beach to clear the space, and the scrape of aluminum on stone sounded obscenely loud in the stillness. My grandfather's book was in my jacket pocket, but I'd memorized the words. They weren't in English or any language I recognized, but the book had provided phonetic spellings. I was supposed to speak them into the fog, into the water, while standing with 1 foot on land and 1 in the lake. The symbolism wasn't subtle. 1 foot in my world, 1 in theirs, bridging the gap, inviting communication. I rolled up my right pant leg and stepped into the water. It was shockingly cold, painfully cold, and within seconds my foot had gone numb. The lake was perfectly still, reflecting nothing because there was no light to reflect. The moon was dark, the stars hidden by fog, and I'd deliberately not brought a flashlight. The ritual required darkness. I began to speak the words. They felt wrong in my mouth, angular and harsh, syllables that human vocal cords weren't meant to produce. But I pushed through, reciting the full incantation just as my grandfather had written it. The fog pressed closer. The water around my foot began to move, not lapping against the shore, but circling, spiraling like water going down a drain. The temperature dropped further, and I started to shiver. Nothing happened for a long moment. Just me standing there, 1 foot in freezing water, speaking nonsense words into the void. I felt foolish, ridiculous. This was insane. What was I doing? Then something answered. Not with words, not at first. With a feeling, a presence, an awareness that suddenly focused on me with the weight of a mountain. I felt seen in a way I'd never experienced before, perceived down to my atoms, known completely. The fog formed shapes, not human shapes, but suggestions of form, spirals and angles and geometries that hurt to look at. And then finally a voice, not from any direction, but from everywhere, from inside my own head. Evan Reed, blood of Jeremiah, keeper of the anchor. It wasn't speaking English, I knew that somehow. It was speaking something older, something more fundamental, and my brain was translating it into words I could understand. I want to negotiate, I said, my voice shaking. I want to discuss terms. You want freedom, you want to leave, to live your life unburdened. Yes. Your grandfather wanted the same. His father wanted the same. All the keepers have wanted the same. The presence shifted, and I felt something like amusement, cold and vast. Yet here you are, bound as they were bound. But we don't have to be. You're intelligent. We can make an arrangement that benefits both of us. You assume I want an arrangement. The water had risen to mid-calf now, though I hadn't moved deeper. It was climbing my leg like something alive, cold tendrils wrapping around my ankle, my shin, my knee. The anchor keeps you contained, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Weak. Wouldn't you want that to end? The anchor keeps me patient, contained, yes, but safe, protected. The alternative to containment is not freedom, it is destruction. I don't understand. Your grandfather understood. In his final years, he understood why I remain here, why I accept the barrier. The presence pressed closer, and I felt something that might have been fear. Not my fear, but its fear. What bound me here is older than your civilization, stronger than your family's magic. If the anchor fails, I am not freed, I am exposed. And there are things that hunt me, Evan Reed. Things that would consume me as I consume human consciousness. Things that cannot be negotiated with. The water was at my thigh now, rising impossibly fast. The cold was agonizing, and I tried to step back to pull my leg from the lake, but I couldn't move. Something held me in place. The anchor protects us both. Your family from me from what waits beyond. This is why Jeremiah created it. Not from love of humanity, but from bargain. From deal. What deal? I gasped. The water was at my waist, and I could feel things moving in it, brushing against my legs, my torso. His brother's life for my protection, his family's service for my containment. I take a few occasionally when the anchor weakens. Small meals, acceptable losses. In exchange, the barrier keeps away what would destroy us all. You're lying. You're trying to manipulate me. Am I? The water was at my chest. I was drowning, standing up, held in place by invisible force while the lake climbed my body. Then abandon the anchor, walk away, let the barrier fail, see what comes. I couldn't breathe. The water was at my neck, my chin rising toward my mouth. I struggled, thrashing, but it was like being encased in concrete. The cold had gone beyond pain into numbness, and I could feel my heart stuttering, slowing. You sought negotiation. Here are the terms. Maintain the anchor or doom us all. Those are the only options. Those have always been the only options. The water covered my face, and I tried to hold my breath, but the cold forced it out in a burst of bubbles. Water rushed into my lungs. I was drowning, dying, and somewhere distant I could hear other voices, the voices of all the others the lake had taken, calling my name, welcoming me. And then I was somewhere else. Not physically. My body was still in the lake, still drowning. But my consciousness, my sense of self, was pulled down. down through the water into depths that shouldn't exist in a lake barely 40 feet deep at its deepest point. I fell through darkness, through cold, through pressure that should have crushed me. And then I saw it. The entity, what lived in Lake Miriam. I can't describe it adequately. It existed in too many dimensions, had too many aspects for my three-dimensional mind to process. But I understood in that moment of connection that it had been telling the truth. It was trapped here, bound by something ancient and powerful that had nothing to do with my family's anchor. The anchor wasn't a prison, it was a hiding place. It masked the entity's presence, made it seem smaller and weaker than it was, kept it hidden from something else. Something that prowled the spaces between hunting entities like this one, consuming them as they consumed humans. Something vast and terrible and hungry in ways that made the lake entity seem almost benign by comparison. I saw my grandfather's deal. Saw the moment 73 years ago when Jeremiah Reed, mad with grief over his brother's death, had performed a very different ritual than the one in his books. Had called out to the entity not to destroy it, but to make a pact. Protection. For protection. The entity would stay hidden, would take only small offerings, and in return the Reed family would maintain the barrier that kept it safe. And I saw what would happen if the anchor failed. The entity exposed, drawing the attention of the hunters. The hunters coming to this place, to this lake, to this world. And what they would do to everything in their path. I saw the truth. My family weren't victims of a curse. We were soldiers in a war we barely understood, holding a line we didn't even know existed. The vision released me, and I was back in my body, still in the water, still drowning. My lungs burned, my heart hammered weakly, and darkness crept in from the edges of my vision. Then suddenly I could move. The force holding me vanished, and I stumbled backward out of the water, collapsing on the shore, coughing up lake water and bile. My leg was blue with cold, my whole body shaking so hard I thought I'd break apart. The fog remained thick and close, but the presence had withdrawn. Only the voice remained, distant now, echoing. You have seen. You understand. Maintain the anchor, Evan Reed. Not for me. For yourself. For all of us. I crawled up the beach, dragged myself through the yard, made it into the house, and barred the door behind me. I stripped off my wet clothes with numb, shaking hands and huddled under every blanket I could find, trying to stop the shaking, trying to process what I'd seen. It was almost dawn before I could think clearly enough to act. I went to the attic, stood within the circle, and performed the feeding ritual with total commitment, with absolute belief. Because I'd seen the truth now. I'd been shown what lay behind the curtain. The anchor wasn't a prison or a burden, it was a shield, and we needed it desperately. As the sun rose, I felt the anchor strengthen, felt its frequency intensify, felt the barrier solidify. Down at the lake, the fog began to retreat. I'd sought negotiation and found something worse, understanding. I'd wanted freedom and discovered I'd never been trapped at all. I'd been chosen, selected, prepared by generations of my family to hold this line. Claire had asked what would happen if I walked away, if I let the anchor fail. Now I knew, and I would never walk away. Winter came to northern Minnesota with brutal efficiency. By November, snow covered the ground in a thick blanket, and the lake froze solid. The fog still came on the coldest nights, seeping up through cracks in the ice, but the voices were muted now, muffled by cold and the strengthening of the anchor. I'd found my rhythm, wake before dawn, perform the feeding ritual with the complete focus of someone who's seen the alternative. Spend the day painting. I discovered I could work with the fear, channel it into art that was dark and strange and more honest than anything I'd created before. Lock the house at sunset and spend the evenings reading my uncle's journal, my grandfather's research, learning everything I could about what I was protecting against. Harold Jensen stopped by once a week with supplies and conversation. He'd noticed the change in me, the transformation from skeptical artist to committed keeper. "You look like your uncle now," he said one afternoon in December, sitting in the kitchen while I made coffee. "Same look in your eyes, like you've seen something the rest of us haven't." "I have," I said simply. "Do I want to know?" "No." He accepted that with a nod. We didn't talk about it again. Claire called occasionally, but our conversations grew shorter and less frequent. We'd experienced something together that neither of us wanted to revisit, and the memory of it sat between us like a wall. She'd gone back to her life in Minneapolis, and I'd stayed here in mine. Eventually the calls stopped. I didn't mind. The solitude was necessary. The work required focus, dedication, a willingness to put this responsibility above everything else. Relationships, career, the normal progression of life, all of it had to be secondary to maintaining the anchor. My artwork changed dramatically. I painted the lake in all its moods, the fog in all its forms, the shadows that moved beneath the ice. Galleries would probably have rejected it as too disturbing, too dark. But I wasn't painting for galleries anymore. I was documenting, bearing witness, creating a record of what I protected against. In late March, as the ice began to break up and the lake returned to liquid form, I received a letter from a law firm in Minneapolis. Another distant relative had died, and I was mentioned in the will. Not as a beneficiary this time, but as a trustee. Apparently, I had a second cousin I'd never met who'd recently passed away, and she'd left instructions that her property, a cabin on Lake Superior, should be offered to me first before being sold. I threw the letter away. One lake was enough, but it made me think about succession, about what would happen when I died. I had no children, no siblings, no obvious heir to pass this responsibility to. My uncle had chosen me because I was the only option, but who would I choose? Who could I burden with this knowledge, this duty? The question haunted me through the spring and into summer. I was only 28. Statistically, I had decades ahead of me. But my uncle had died at 68 and my grandfather at 73, and both younger than they should have been. The work aged you, wore you down, consumed you slowly. I needed to prepare, to find and train someone, to ensure the anchor would be maintained after I was gone. But who? And how do you explain this to someone without sounding insane? In July, a young couple showed up at the house, lost on the back roads. They'd been hiking in the state forest and gotten turned around, and their GPS had died. Could they use my phone? I let them in, gave them directions back to the main highway, watched them drive away. But before they left, the man asked if I knew whether Lake Miriam allowed camping. They were looking for a place to spend the night, somewhere quiet and scenic. "No," I said immediately. "The lake is private property, no camping allowed." It was a lie. Most of the lakeshore was public forest land. But I couldn't let them stay here. Couldn't risk them being out on the water at night, breaking rules they didn't know existed. They left disappointed, and I felt the weight of it. How many others had I turned away over the months? How many people had I denied access to this beautiful place because I knew what waited in its depths? Was this sustainable? Could I spend the rest of my life as a hermit, a guardian protecting people who would never know I existed, never thank me, never understand what I'd sacrificed? The doubt tried to creep back in, but now I had armor against it. I'd seen the truth. I'd been shown what lay beyond the barrier. Whenever doubt threatened, I remembered that vision, that moment of understanding in the depths. I was not a victim. I was a soldier. This was not a curse. It was a calling. August brought tourists and kayakers, people drawn to the lake's reputation for clear water and good fishing. I put up signs, private property, no trespassing. Dangerous undercurrents. Most people respected them, some didn't. On a Thursday afternoon, I found a young man in his early 20s setting up a tent on the beach. He'd parked his car at the end of the road and hiked in, ignoring the signs. "You need to leave," I told him. He looked up, annoyed. "The forest is public land. You can't keep me out. The lake is dangerous. People have drowned here. I'm a strong swimmer. I'll be fine." I could have called the sheriff, had him removed for trespassing, but it would take an hour for the sheriff to arrive, and by then the sun would be setting. I couldn't risk it. "I'm asking you to leave," I said. "Please." Something in my voice must have gotten through. He looked at me, really looked at me, and whatever he saw made him nervous. "Okay, man, okay. I'm going." He packed up quickly and left, casting looks back at me like I was dangerous. Maybe I was. Maybe that's what this place required. That night I dreamed of my uncle. He was standing at the edge of the lake looking out over the water, and when he turned to me his eyes were hollow, empty, consumed. "It takes everything," he said. "You know that now." "I know. And you're staying anyway." "I don't have a choice." He smiled, and it was sad but also proud. "You always have a choice, Evan. You're just brave enough to make the right one." I woke to dawn light and the sound of loons calling across the water. Another day, another feeding, another night of vigilance. The work continued. By September, exactly 1 year after I'd first arrived, I'd settled into the role completely. The house was mine now, not my uncle's. I'd moved his belongings to the attic, brought in my own furniture, made the space reflect me rather than him. But the rules remained, written in his handwriting, pinned to the wall above the kitchen counter. I read them every day, a reminder and a promise. Harold stopped by on the anniversary of my uncle's death. We stood together on the porch looking out at the lake in the afternoon light. It was beautiful, impossibly beautiful, and deadly as a loaded gun. "Your uncle would be proud," Harold said quietly. "You've done well." "I saw it," I told him. "The thing in the lake. What we're really protecting against. Daniel said you would. Said you'd need to see it to truly commit." Harold was quiet for a moment. "Do you regret it? Coming here?" I thought about my life before. The stress, the rejection, the feeling of meaninglessness. Then I thought about my life now. The purpose, the clarity, the knowledge that every day I did something that mattered, even if no one else would ever know. "No," I said. "I don't regret it." "Good." Harold patted my shoulder. "You'll need that certainty for what's coming." "What's coming?" But he just shook his head and left, and I watched his truck disappear down the road with a growing sense of unease. That night the fog came heavier than it had in months. And the voice that called to me wasn't one I'd heard before. It was my own voice calling back to me from the fog. "Evan, come out. Evan, we need to talk. Evan." I stayed inside, windows locked, heart pounding. Because I understood what this meant. The entity was learning, adapting, finding new ways to test the barrier. And it would never stop testing, never stop pushing, never stop trying to see if I would slip, if I would fail. This was my life now. This was my purpose. And I would hold this line until the day I died. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in October, 2 years after I'd first come to Lake Miriam. Heavy cream paper, expensive stationery, a return address in Chicago. I almost didn't open it. I'd stopped caring about mail from the outside world, stopped maintaining connections with my old life. But something made me open this one. "Dear Mr. Reed, you don't know me, but my name is Marcus Reed. I'm your second cousin, grandson of your grandfather's younger sister. I've been researching our family history, and your name came up in connection with property in northern Minnesota. I understand you inherited the old lake house from Daniel Reed. I'm an anthropologist specializing in indigenous American folklore and belief systems. My research has led me to some fascinating connections between our family and the Ojibwe history of the Lake Miriam area. I believe your grandfather may have been involved in preserving or documenting significant cultural practices. I would very much like to visit and discuss this with you. I'll be in Minnesota next month for a conference. Would November 15th work for a visit? Sincerely, Marcus Reed. PhD, I read the letter 3 times, my hands shaking. An anthropologist, interested in family history, wanting to visit. This was how it happened. This was how the responsibility passed to the next generation. I wrote back immediately inviting him to come, and then I began to prepare. November 15th came cold and clear. I'd cleaned the house, organized my uncle's research in the study, prepared myself for what needed to be said. Marcus arrived in a rental car just after noon, a tall black man in his early 30s with an easy smile and wire-rimmed glasses. Evan, he shook my hand firmly. Thank you so much for agreeing to see me. This place is incredible, exactly as my grandmother described it. Your grandmother was here? Once when she was young. She told stories about it, about the lake, about the fog, about her brother Jeremiah and his strange obsessions. Marcus looked out at the water. She said he was trying to protect something, or protect people from something. She was never clear. Come inside, I said. We should talk. I made coffee and we sat in the study, surrounded by 3 generations of research. Marcus's eyes went wide as he took it in. The books, the journals, the maps, the photographs. My God, he breathed. This is an archive. A complete ethnographic archive of... He stopped, noticing the symbols drawn in some of the margins, the strange notations. What exactly was Jeremiah studying? Not studying, I said. Fighting? Or containing, I guess. It's complicated. I told him everything. The rules, the fog, the voices, the anchor, the entity in the lake. I showed him my uncle's journal and my grandfather's research. I told him about my own experience, about what I'd seen in the depths, about the bargain that had been struck generations ago. Marcus listened without interrupting, his expression moving from skepticism to concern to something like awe. When I finished, he sat in silence for a long moment. You're serious, he finally said. Completely. And you want me to believe that there's some kind of extra-dimensional entity in the lake that feeds on human consciousness, and our family has been containing it for a century. Yes. That's... He trailed off, looking at the volumes of research, the careful documentation, the decades of evidence. That's either the most elaborate delusion I've ever encountered or it's true, and I'm not sure which possibility is more terrifying. It's true, I said quietly, and I can prove it. But the proof comes with a cost. Once you see, once you know for certain, you can't unknow it, and you'll have a choice to make. What choice? Whether to walk away and live your life, or stay and learn. Because I need a successor, Marcus. Someone to continue this work when I can't anymore. Someone who understands what we're protecting against. He looked at me, and I could see the war happening behind his eyes. The academic in him was fascinated, desperate to know if this was real. But the rational person was terrified of what confirmation would mean for his life. How would you prove it? He asked. Tonight, I said. When the fog comes, when the voices call, you'll see for yourself. We spent the afternoon going through the archives together. Marcus had questions, hundreds of them, and I answered as best I could. He examined my grandfather's drawings, read excerpts from my uncle's journal, studied the photographs of the lake across decades. His anthropological training gave him a framework for understanding what my family had been doing, even if the reality of it still seemed impossible to him. "This is similar to indigenous practices I've studied," he said, paging through one of Jeremiah's notebooks. "The idea of boundary keepers, of individuals who maintain barriers between worlds. The Ojibwe had guardians who performed similar roles, people who kept watch over places where the spirit world pressed close to ours. My grandfather learned from them," I said, "or tried to. Most wouldn't talk to him, but he found some sources, some elders who recognized what he was dealing with. And he created the anchor based on their knowledge. Combined with his own research, engineering principles applied to spiritual problems. It shouldn't work, but it does." As the sun began to set, I showed Marcus the rituals, how to lock the windows, how to check the doors, how to prepare the house for nightfall. He watched with the careful attention of someone taking notes for a dissertation, documenting everything. When the fog began to roll in, I saw his expression change, the thick, unnatural wall of white advancing across the lake, moving against the wind, defying every principle of meteorology. That was when it stopped being theoretical and became real. "Jesus," he whispered. "Come upstairs," I said. "I'll show you the anchor." In the attic, standing at the edge of the circle while the symbols glowed faintly and the twisted pillar of the anchor hummed its low frequency, I performed the feeding ritual. Marcus watched in silence as I focused my will, strengthened the barrier, maintained the protection. Below us, the voices began. "Evan, Qualsa, Marcus, come outside. Evan, oh, Marcus, we know you're there." Marcus went pale. "That's my name." "How does it know my name?" "It knows everything about us. The moment you set foot on the property, it learned you. That's what it does." The voices continued, cycling through different tones, different approaches. Sometimes pleading, sometimes demanding, sometimes seductive. Always trying to get us to respond, to open a door, to break the rules. We sat in the attic all night, Marcus listening to his name being called by the voice of his dead grandmother, his childhood best friend, his ex-girlfriend. Each voice perfect, each one saying exactly the right things to make him want to answer. But he didn't answer. He held firm, tears running down his face, but held firm. By dawn, when the fog retreated and the voices faded, Marcus understood. He'd seen the truth, felt the presence pressing against the barrier, experienced the cost of this knowledge. "I'm an anthropologist," he said hoarsely. "I study cultures and beliefs and practices, but this is real. This is actually real." "Yes. And you do this every night?" "Every night for 2 years. My uncle did it for 40 years before me." Marcus was quiet for a long time, looking out the attic window at the lake in the early morning light. "You need me to take over eventually. I need you to be ready to take over, to learn the work, to understand it, so when my time comes, the anchor doesn't fail. What if I say no? What if I walk away? Then I find someone else, or I don't, and when I die, the barrier eventually fails, and everyone, not just in this area, but potentially far beyond, pays the price." He turned to look at me. "That's not really a choice, is it?" "No," I admitted, "it's not. But I'm giving you the honesty my uncle gave me. You can walk away now before you're committed, before you've performed the ritual yourself, before you've bonded with the anchor. Right now, you're just a witness. You can still have a normal life. But you couldn't. I could have. I chose this. And I need you to choose it too, not from obligation, not from family duty, but because you understand what's at stake and you're willing to sacrifice your normal life to protect others." Marcus spent another day at the house, reading, learning, thinking. I taught him the basics of the feeding ritual, showed him how to maintain the anchor, shared everything I'd learned over 2 years. But I didn't pressure him, didn't try to manipulate him into staying. This had to be his choice. On the evening of the second day, as he was preparing to leave, Marcus stood on the porch looking out at the lake. The water was calm, beautiful, reflecting the sunset colors like liquid fire. Anyone would think it was paradise. "I have a life in Chicago," he said. "A teaching position, research projects, friends, a girlfriend I was thinking of proposing to." "I know. But I also know what I saw, what's real, and I know what happens if someone doesn't do this work." He turned to me. "I can't take over yet. My life is in Chicago, my career is there, but I can learn, I can visit regularly, study the archives, train. So when the time comes when you need me, I'll be ready." I felt a weight lift that I hadn't realized I was carrying. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. I'm not doing this for you or even for our family. I'm doing it because now that I know, I can't walk away any more than you could." Marcus left the next morning, taking copies of some of the key documents, promising to return in a month. We'd work out a training schedule, a way for him to learn the work without abandoning his life completely. It was a beginning. Not perfect, but better than nothing. Better than dying alone and leaving the anchor to fail. After he left, I performed the feeding ritual with renewed purpose. The succession was secured. The work would continue. The barrier would hold. For now, that was enough. 3 years later, a new car turned down the driveway. Not Marcus this time. He'd visited regularly, learned the rituals, bonded with the anchor enough that he could maintain it for a few days when I needed to go into town for supplies. This was someone else, a woman in her mid-20s, dark hair, carrying a backpack and a folder. She knocked on the door, and when I opened it, she said, "Evan Reed? My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm writing a book about unexplained disappearances in northern Minnesota, and Lake Miriam has a fascinating history. Would you be willing to answer some questions?" I looked at her, at the eager curiosity in her eyes, at the notebook in her hand. Another person drawn to the lake, to its mystery, to the stories that circulated despite our best efforts to suppress them. I thought about turning her away, protecting her from the knowledge. But I also thought about succession, about the need for others who understood, who could help carry this burden. "Come in," I said. "We should talk." And as she stepped across the threshold, I saw the fog beginning to form on the lake, even though it was only afternoon. The entity was interested in this new visitor, curious, hungry. I closed the door behind her and began to explain the rules. The cycle continued. The work continued. The barrier held, and it always would as long as people like me, like Marcus, like Sarah, like all the potential keepers I would find and train over the years, were willing to sacrifice everything to hold the line. This was my legacy. Not art, not fame, not the normal life I'd once imagined. This was what I left behind. Protection, safety, the thin barrier between the world and what waited in the depths. It was enough. It had to be enough. Because the alternative was unthinkable. Author's note found in Evan Reed's journal, dated 5 years after his arrival. "If you're reading this, I'm gone. The house is yours now, along with everything in it, the archives, the anchor, the responsibility. You've been trained. You understand what needs to be done. The feeding ritual must be performed daily. The rules must be followed exactly. The barrier must be maintained. But know this, you are not alone. Others know. Others are watching. Others will help when they can. We are part of a network, a line of guardians stretching back centuries forward into the future. Our work is invisible, thankless, endless. But it matters. Every day you maintain the anchor is a day hundreds of people swim safely in the lake, hike safely through the woods, live safely in the area. They'll never know what you did for them. They'll never thank you. But that doesn't make it less important. You are a keeper, a guardian, a soldier in a war most people don't know is being fought. Hold the line. The work continues.